I'll start off with an intro of Sophie, give a bit of her background, and kick off with some questions that we've collected ahead of time from people who have RSVP'd and from the Joro team. And then about halfway through, we'll break for everyone in this group to be able to chime in with their questions as well. So to kick things off, Sophie, as you guys all know, is the author of How to Be a Conscious Eater, the beautiful poster behind her. Also a regular contributor to the New York Times Health section, and the founder of Full Table Solutions, a consulting practice that's a catalyst for food systems transformation. She also served as the Director of Health and Sustainability Leadership and the Editorial Director for the Culinary Institute of America's Strategic Initiatives Group, and has worked for a while at the intersection of human and environmental health. So we're very lucky to have her here. She's based in Boulder, as we've been chatting about with the weather, but now we all get to be here virtually. And we were really excited to read Sophie's book and to hear some of her insights about the intersection between human health, animal health, and planetary health. At Joro, we're very interested in ways that people can make climate action part of their daily practice in a way that works for their own lifestyles. We very much meet people where they are and have created this space out of a recognition that there's almost like a lack of inclusion in the climate space. There's often a dialogue that happens around the importance of going vegan or you're a bad person. And there's clearly a middle ground of everyone trying to do their best from where they are. And in fact, if we all make incremental steps forward, we can not only have an immense climate impact, but also shift the systems that serve us. So that's a lot of the work that we're trying to do at Joro. I want to kick us off just by asking Sophie to tell us a little bit more about your journey. How did you become interested in sustainability and food?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's fun to have this more informal format and really look forward to discussion as much as sharing my own thoughts. And I really am always eager to hear your own perspectives. To answer your question, I would say my interest in food started actually in 4th grade. My family moved to the Chianti region of Italy. So my parents are both writers, and my dad thought it'd be fun to edit his book in Tuscany. And so he decided that we were moving there for most of my 4th grade year. And I'm born and raised in Seattle, Washington, very urban environment. And so to go not only to a foreign country, a school where I didn't speak the language, but we lived on a farm, and we lived above 2 tenant farmers. Their primary products were it was olive oil. And it was so eye-opening to me. I was a very picky eater as a kid, but it was literally the first time that I understood that the chicken nuggets in the freezer came from that chicken waking me up every morning. Like the concept of people tending the land, foods that I put in my body coming from animals, coming from orchards, coming from plants. This was very eye-opening to me. Now, it's not like, okay, I became a conscious eater at age 10, but it was really, I think the seeds were planted then for a lifelong interest in, certainly for my family in Italy. We went back often. And then it was actually my junior year of college when I studied abroad in Bologna. And I chose Bologna because it is the belly of Italy, as it's called, the stomach of Italy. It's the gastronomic capital. My interest in food had really grown, and I had the chance to take a class there by an incredible professor named Massimo Montanari, and it was all about the cultural history of food. It was the first time that I ever heard the concept of a food culture. Like, I didn't have that language before, but I understood then, all of those years prior of my visits and that first kind of awakening, all the ways in which American food culture are very different from Italian food culture in many, many ways. So that was sort of the beginning of an intellectual passion around understanding food, the ways that it's so interconnected to identity and heritage. But then I came back to Stanford, is where I went for undergrad. And then I was so eager to channel this interest in food somewhere. And there really weren't a lot of career pathways, and I could speak about that ad nauseum. But I decided to become the dining hall manager actually for a student-led dining hall. So then I had the chance to now work on all the procurement and all the menu decisions with the chef, in charge of like 50 different students were on the meal plan. And that was just a really much more eye-opening, also kind of understanding of how, you know, distribution systems work and institutional purchasing and the power that lies there. In terms of sustainability specifically, I would say it had to do with actually my first job out of school, which was working at Sunset Magazine. So I was a food and travel writer, and I found myself always working in like an environmental angle. You know, holiday shopping, it's a lifestyle publication. It's very kind of fluffy, to be honest. But I would always sort of like, okay, you're going wine tasting, go wine tasting by bike instead of by limousine, right? Or you know, holiday shopping, can you take public transit or support local businesses? Those kinds of small steps that I think now, again, really relate to like that conscious consumer idea. And that ultimately brought me into my Master of Public Health program at UC Berkeley. I was like, food is connected to everything. Holy cow, you know, politics, the economy, religion. I mean, it's like the central, you know, hub of this giant wheel with so many spokes. And that to me just ignited this fire to like go down every single spoke: policy, writing. I took food writing with Michael Pollan at Berkeley, did design thinking for food, and really looked at the business side. So those, I think, were some pretty formative experiences. And certainly I could go into more detail, but definitely my role at the Culinary Institute of America for, you know, 5.5 years, channeled what was essentially an interest into a real, you know, expertise and thought leadership to the $860 billion food service industry. Yeah, that's, I guess, the journey in a nutshell.
That's really fascinating. I love the fact that you were a dining hall manager. I was also a dining hall manager in college, and that was also the way that I started thinking about the aggregation of food and the environmental impacts of food. I was the sustainability chair for my dining hall, and I would work with the chef to plan out meals. And I saw that his planning accounted for how many vegetarians we had eating at the dining hall. And so I noticed that, like, even if we increased, I think we had something like 5 out of 300 students or something were vegetarian. And for that reason, he always had a vegetarian entree. And I saw that if we had 10 vegetarians, he would change the amount of vegetables and meat he ordered. And that was kind of eye-opening to me, because I think at the individual level, we think that our choices don't matter. But when you start to see how those individual choices add up to, you know, the person who's staffing or stocking the supermarket, and then the person who's stocking the wholesaler that's serving the supermarket, that's where you really start to see the aggregation effects happen. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that resonates with me 1,000%. And it was, I think, also really interesting to see where does people's interest in sustainable eating, how far does that go? Like, what are they willing to sacrifice? And what I really found frustrating was that every time I wanted to do something sustainable in the dining hall, like my big victory was getting, shifting to world-centric compostable to-go ware, right? This was like groundbreaking at the time. I mean, now it's very commonplace, but it was like, well, is there the infrastructure for commercial composting? And those cost 5 times as much. And so where are we going to get, you know, where are we going to offset those costs? And could we get students to, you know, would they be willing to pay a little bit more? And it's like, most of them are not willing to. And now in my work, you see that over and over and over, that like, in general, to make a more conscious choice, right? And I could, you know, get into this in detail, but like the majority of the time, those options are worse for you. Like, it's a compromised user experience. It costs more. You have to go out of your way. You're like a salmon swimming upstream. And so I just look forward to sort of the shift in the marketplace to the point where the defaults are this way, as opposed to the other way around.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really interesting, because also, even if just more people said that they were vegetarian, or said that they were eating a mostly vegetarian diet or a partially vegetarian diet, that would shift a lot of the defaults. Like using a dining hall as an example, if the default was that everyone would eat vegetables and some people would eat meat, then you might have 3 vegetarian entrees and 1 meat entree instead of the other way around, which tends to be how it is. And even those shifts can make major changes.
Well, and that's the power too of flexitarianism. I mean,
Exactly,
because the idea is that maybe you're having a vegan breakfast, a vegetarian lunch, and maybe a omnivorous dinner. And so you may not as an individual identify as a vegetarian or vegan, but the beauty of flexitarianism is like it's that Big Ten approach that includes all of those options, and it still accomplishes the goal of sending the signal to the choice architecture decision makers that you have to have those options, and that affects the purchasing, which affects everything.
So tell us a little more about this book in particular. Tell us about the Conscious Eater framework and the process of writing it.
Yeah, so my first book is called Devoured. It's all about the American food psyche. So it's really sort of an anthropological look at why we eat what and how we eat in the United States. Draws in a lot of different social science disciplines. And in that book, I essentially put forward this argument that there are three core values that are baked into a lot of Americana and kind of educational systems and things like that that affect eating habits for better and for worse. And those are work, freedom, and progress. And it leads to things like eating at our desks, eating on the go, eating alone, eating lots of stunt foods and bizarre novelty foods, and feeling the expectation that we deserve to and should always be able to customize our food choices. During that time of that book, events like this, dozens and dozens of radio interviews, I would hear from people the same thing over and over, which is like, okay, this is really fascinating, but what should I eat? Coconut oil or olive oil. And I had tried really intentionally in that book to not be prescriptive. It was trying to essentially give people a bird's eye view and then empower them to kind of see the marketing poison things that were undermining their efforts to eat healthfully or in other ways that align with their values. And so it led me to think, okay, actually what I think there's a yearning for is not just a portrait of what values are driving American food choices, but what values should or could be. And that's what really led me to How to Be a Conscious Eater, which is also the framework there is essentially a mental checklist of deciding between this or that food, this or that menu item. It's asking yourself, is this food good for me? Is it good for others? And is it good for the planet? And that essentially is a cohesive, holistic set of apertures. And part of the experience, one of the experiences that led me to want to sort of give people additional sets of, additional apertures is that during my time as a contributor to the New York Times Health section, I answer a lot of reader questions. So it's this Ask Well platform. And so often it's very myopic in the question itself. And I found myself almost wanting to like reframe the question, It's not about, grass-fed or conventional beef so much as it's about we need to lower the total amount of beef for environmental reasons. And only seeing a lot of food tribalism as well with folks kind of viewing everything through, an animal welfare lens as a self-declared vegan, or through a climate lens as a reducitarian, or through a health lens as a, on Whole30 or whatever it is, and not seeing the interconnectedness and opportunities for interconnected positive impacts, like win-win-win, right? Good for you, good for others, good for the planet. The other kind of major piece that led me to writing this book is just seeing how much anxiety and confusion there is about food choices. There's an annual survey by IFIC Foundation, International Food Information Council Foundation, that has found that 8 in 10 Americans are confused about what to eat. And this makes the vast majority of them doubt their choices. And that's just such a bummer because food is, there's a lot of other things to stress out about. Food should be a source of joy, of comfort, of nourishment. And this real lack of, people have called it the lack of food literacy or confidence, certainly in the kitchen, and that's separate too with culinary confidence. But I really wanted to reassure folks, to empower eaters to make food choices they can eat, that they can feel good about. And give them answers. Yes, they want the bottom line, give me the short and sweet version that's rigorous, that's evidence-based, that's not woo-woo and dogmatic, but also to really offer, I saw an opportunity to offer a longer-term decision-making framework. So in the book, there's 60 topics, and those I think will be, good for quite a few years, but there will be more topics and more issues to contend with inevitably. We didn't, as folks, eaters, conscious eaters, companies, governments demand greater transparency, there will be more and more issues brought to light, but having this kind of touchstone set of questions to be asking yourself can, for the long haul, I think, really serve as that decision-making compass that they will help instill a bit more of that confidence while also looking at things through a bit more of that holistic kind of set of lenses.
Yeah, I really like this idea of food literacy as a concept. And it kind of relates to how we think about helping users develop a carbon intuition of helping them understand. Our goal isn't to have people memorize that, a burger is 5 kgs of CO2, but rather have a relative understanding, that an intuition that beef is relatively worse than fish. And if you're making that choice, not to stress about what brand of beef you're buying, but to think about, is there another protein I'd prefer to swap out? And that would be better for me and better for the planet. And I think another place literacy comes up is labels, in particular at the grocery store. Can you talk a little bit about what labels to pay attention to, how you use labels, if at all, in your choices?
Yeah, this is a big source of that confusion and source of that anxiety, I think. Just to briefly kind of build on what you said, I mean, I agree completely. And the other piece I wanted to mention is, it's not, with this kind of set of questions, is it good for me, is it good for others, is it good for the planet? It's not to expect that every single food you put in your body will check all 3 boxes every time, right? It's more of a relative scale, a spectrum. Often people think of like, is it good, is it bad? And it's more the question of as opposed to what. And being able to ask yourself, okay, especially for those more routinized eating habits, the things you do repeatedly, your morning coffee ritual, your weekday lunch routine, your Friday night, takeout habit, it's at least worth asking in those cases, like, does this item at least check one of these boxes? If not, is it really worth my, hard-earned dollars? What signal am I sending, right? It's voting with your vote is incredibly important. Food policy we can talk about, but also voting with your fork, with your grocery basket, with all of that. The other piece of it is just the big scheme of things and how market forces really can respond to that collective demand. So it's like you said, like individuals, maybe you don't feel like your weekday lunch routine matters, but in the aggregate, it really does. So anyway, I just wanted to build on that point that you made there. In terms of labels, they can absolutely be intimidating and overwhelming. I have sections in the book that are basically cheat sheets of kind of which labels to pay attention to and which ones are completely meaningless. Like you said, I don't expect anyone to memorize these, but the short answer is that some of the labels matter and have meaning, and some of them don't. There's tremendous variety basically in which terms are regulated and therefore have meaning and which ones are not. So like you can take eggs, for instance, natural, farm fresh, those aren't regulated. Organic, on the other hand, is highly regulated. It is one of the most rigorous frameworks out there. It really means a lot. And so it's on that list of third-party certifications that I suggest paying attention to, and that have strict criteria and regular audits. And therefore, in a lot of these cases, the question is like, is that worth extra money? And it should be, because it's a shorthand for a whole set of practices that are essentially, there's a whole growing movement around true cost accounting. And it's this point of, okay, putting a price on the externalities of producing food, right? If you see $1 burger on a fast food menu, you should really wonder whose lives are worse because of that. Animals, the workers, the poultry processor, the slaughterhouse workers, in order to bring you that item that's that incredibly low. That is not the true cost of the item. And so with true cost accounting, some of these third-party certifiers like organic are reflecting that this is actually it has greater value in terms of how it's produced and the externalities it's not shipping downstream, right? It's the pesticides it's not using and harming, farm worker health, for example. So the way I think about it as like a whole is that there's, when it comes to being a conscious eater, transparency is the name of the game. And third-party certifiers are the referees of that game. So another reason that it's helpful to have these shorthands is it's unrealistic for each of us to visit every farm, every fishery, every source of food before we put it in our mouths, in our grocery baskets. And you may have a long laundry list of humane animal husbandry practices you're looking for, but that's where if you understand the certifying agencies that have rigorous criteria, that do regular audits, that you can trust, that can be basically a time saver and a symbol of many more layers of meaning. So some examples of that are fair trade on the worker wages front, in sustainable seafood. There's Seafood Watch, MSC, and ASC, so Marine Stewardship Council. Those have a great many factors accounted for that make them sustainable, versus if you just saw the term sustainable on the shrimp, it wouldn't have all of that depth of meaning behind it. So it's very tricky, it's very challenging, but I do put some faith in these third parties because again, they're going to the trouble, and they're kind of the accountability mechanisms that go beyond just greenwashing or kind of empty marketing buzzwords.
Mm-hmm. I want to start encouraging anyone on this group to start putting questions as they come up into the chat. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but then we'll start pulling from whoever else wants to jump in, because we're starting to get into, I think, some of the details of like, how do we actually make good food choices? And I was wondering if you'd be willing to zoom in on the choice of eggs in particular, because I feel like this is one that people are overwhelmed by. Which eggs do you buy, and how do you decide?
Yeah. So I buy eggs that are pasture raised. So one of the things that's helpful to know is that, okay, this gets complicated. Eggs, I'll just give a caveat that eggs and seafood are the most complicated, I think, of all the food choices. So cage-free, free-range, pasture-raised. That goes in ascending order of basically how much space the chickens had. So the problem is that by themselves, those terms aren't regulated. So this is where there's three kind of gold standard animal welfare ratings, or stickers, if you will. They're animal welfare approved, certified, humane, raised, and handled, and GAP certified, or Global Animal Partnership certified. When I see pasture raised plus one of those three symbols, those are the eggs I buy. Because I'm like, okay, it's the most amount of space. A lot of these other ones, sometimes it accounts for basically what the living conditions were of the animal in broad terms, in terms of animal welfare. What animal welfare certifiers are looking for is what is the extent to which an animal was allowed to exhibit its natural behaviors. Do its natural chicken thing is like literally the terminology that they use. So on that scale, I know that pasture raised is going to mean, so like cage free, for example, is only like literally not in a cage, but does not guarantee any outdoor access. Free range, in practice, there's outdoor space, or in principle, there's outdoor space, but it could be very small. And then with pasture raised, it means mostly outside. Some folks, so that's like the answer I could just stop with, because there's a lot of other stuff that basically you just ignore. The other thing I should mention is that none of those things have to do with what the animal, well, a lot of folks who are, if you're vegetarian, for example, you would want to look also for vegetarian feed, because that's not a guarantee. Now that is baked into the organic certification because that's what eggs or chickens are naturally supposed to eat. But
Interesting.
that's basically pairing. This is where I like the shorthand of the trust of GAP certified, animal welfare approved, or humane raised and handled. And there's the reason I say those top three is that's like consensus by I interviewed like the majority of the animal welfare kind of NGOs. And it was interesting to me that they have a little bit of that hierarchy and kind of, you know, whose criteria are up to their, you know, standards.
I think that's also a really good like rule of thumb or intuition for people to build is which labels pair together to give you the holistic answer you're looking for. So thinking about organic plus animal welfare as an important blend of like humane plus environmentally friendly plus good for me. I think the fact that they stack is actually really important to point out.
Yeah, stack. That's an interesting way to say it, I think.
We definitely have a couple questions on here, and Kurt or Rachel, feel free to hop in with questions about organic in particular and how regulated it is for fresh and processed products, what non-synthetic pesticides means.
Yeah, organic definitely gets a lot of attention because it's this big question of like, is it worth it, right? And what does it really mean? It's one of those ones, actually as a side note, one of the crusaders of organic is an amazing woman named Kathleen Merrigan. She's the former Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. And she now directs a really cool center called the Sweetie Center at Arizona State University. Anyway, she has given one of the most powerful, detailed kind of polemics on why organic actually matters more than anyone realizes. It's gotten sort of attached with a lot of other buzzwords that don't have meaning, but she was at the forefront of creating a lot of this criteria. Of course, she's naturally incentivized to tell us why it's wonderful. But the point is actually, you can look up on YouTube. She has, I think it was at Edible Education at Berkeley in the spring that she really kind of gave the deeper dive on this. But to answer their question, so in terms of processed foods, what it means is that 95% or more of the ingredients in the product were certified organic. So with a fresh product, it means that product as a whole, because it's one whole intact item, is certified organic. And the three main things of organic certification are that it's no synthetic pesticides, no growth hormones, and no antibiotics. So where I think folks get into misunderstanding what organic means is there's a concept actually described in my book, Devoured, that's quite relevant, which is the notion of health halos. So often we see terms like local or organic and think gluten-free is actually another example, and think that food is healthier. There is nothing that says that organic foods are healthier by, automatically. Now, you could say, well, they don't have the crappy pesticides. That's true. But like nutritionally, it could have more sugar than a conventional equivalent, right? Or more sodium or any number of other kind of negative health aspects. So it's important just to know kind of what it means and what it doesn't mean. Another example in organic is not the certification to look for animal welfare standards. It is, like I was saying before, it has to do with more of the feed and how the feed was grown, like how the feed was grown. So the grain or whatever that is feeding the animal, that might be relevant in the organic certification on an animal product, but it doesn't have to do with how the animal's raised. So it has some standards, but it's not at the level, it's a USDA program, it's not at the most rigorous in terms of animal welfare. So it's great for your own, kind of avoidance of pesticides, synthetic pesticides, your own avoidance of, growth hormones, in terms of ecosystem impacts, runoff, impact on surrounding wildlife habitat, and farm worker health, because of these less intensive practices. So I don't actually have that much insight on the non-synthetic pesticides question. I know there's been a lot of efforts in conventional agriculture to downplay this difference and say, well, they're still using pesticides in organic. It essentially, my understanding is that they're derived from raw ingredients that are less harmful than, and certainly what we know is that on the extreme level, in the vast array of pesticides that do get used in conventional agriculture, there are some very well documented, carcinogenic outcomes with certain synthetic pesticides. So you can at least be assured that you're not getting those most harmful ones, even if, yes, you're still getting some non-synthetic pesticides, if that makes sense.
It sounds like, from what you were describing, a lot of the underlying factors that they're looking for with the organic certification have to do with toxicity or different sources of toxicity for you, in terms of runoff for the planet or for the animals themselves. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, there are, certainly, well, so what's problematic in the US is there's some toxicology thresholds that, this is like wearing my public health hat, that to get a product out into the world, you presumably have to demonstrate it, but the reality of the FDA is that we don't have the precautionary principle. So and a lot of people have noticed that cosmetics and a lot of other products, toys, all kinds of baby related things that are made in Europe are just less harmful. And you're like, what's the deal with that? And it has to do with the approval process for new products. And essentially the precautionary principle says you have to prove that this product is not harmful. In the US, we say it's the other way around. So it's assumed safe until proven otherwise. And what happens here, oh no, we lost Sanchali. What happens is that in practice, humans are the guinea pigs. It's really outrageous, in my view, that you have items that are put out into the food supply. Trans fat is the most recent example of this, where after decades in all kinds of products, the FDA says, oops, it's actually not generally recognized as safe. Let's reel it back and ban it and remove it from all the products. So that's, I share that just as the broad regulatory framework that governs a lot of what's used in food production as well as in food manufacturing.
Okay, seems like we lost Sanchali, so I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, she's just slacking me. She lost her internet. So I'll just keep on asking questions. One question I had was following on the egg question around palm oil. I don't know if you had any insights about what to do, how to think about this ingredients in Nutella. I love Nutella, but
yes,
I can't eat Nutella anymore, and I want you to say that I can.
I am in general not an absolutist. I think that, like Sanchali was describing, these all or nothing approaches generally tend not to work for most people for long periods of time. So I'm very rarely going to say don't eat that or remove that completely from your diet. That said, I especially come back to what are your go-tos, your routinized habits, your rituals, the things you're buying that over the course of your lifetime are going to have a big impact, right? Not what did you eat on your birthday dinner or what do you eat on vacation? I actually don't care. I mean, I care. I hope it was great, but I don't care in the sense of the impact on your own health and on others and on the planet. So in terms of Nutella, if this is something you're buying regularly, it's not great. It's not terribly healthy. It has 21 grams of sugar per serving, which is twice, or I forget the exact amount. That's a lot more than you would want to be eating in a sitting. The suggested daily limit is 25 to 36 grams. So that's almost your whole sugar budget right there. And to your question, palm oil is the second ingredient. So Nutella, interestingly, probably because of how much flack they've gotten. They do use exclusively certified sustainable palm oil, but how do I say this? It doesn't mean that the rate of palm oil production in the world is something the planet can sustain in terms of deforestation, which is the largest issue. So I would basically say, try to keep an eye out on the number of products that have palm oil in them. When you're buying products that have palm oil in them, there's actually a great scorecard that World Wildlife Fund, again, a third party, they have a palm oil buyer's scorecard. And you can keep track, at least on food service, because the thing is to keep in mind, it's not just household products, right? Like fast food, restaurants, they use this as well. So you can at least keep an eye out for that. There are labels, obviously, on products for the more sustainably sourced palm oil. But the big thing I would say is, just like for your own health too, is to just keep that to a minimum. And it appears in a shockingly ubiquitous number of products, which means just that the total amount, again, in production right now is not something that the planet can sustain. Welcome back, Sanchali.
Thanks.
Looks like we talked about palm oil.
Oh, cool. Yeah, actually, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about oils in general. I don't know if you touched on that, but about what types of oils people should think about using, as if there's any sort of hierarchy of which oils are best.
There is a hierarchy. So in short, plant oils, so I think about this more in terms of like, what are your go-to cooking fats? So oils, as a simple rule of thumb, plant-based oils are going to be better than animal-based cooking fats for you and the planet. We can talk more about why, but that's the basic takeaway. Then within plant-sourced oils, those that are solid at room temperature are going to be worse for you than those that are liquid at room temperature. So that's where palm oil, coconut oil, going into the animal territory, lard, I'm missing a big one, margarine, if you can even find margarine anymore. So the three major types of fats, quick nutrition lesson, are saturated and two types of unsaturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Basically, for your own health, when it comes to cooking fats, you're trying to get the highest percentage or ratio of the unsaturated fats to saturated fats. The ones that are animal-based and solid at room temperature, such as coconut oil, have really high percentage of saturated fat. And so that just doesn't do great things for your long-term health in terms of all kinds of health outcomes. And then the animal sourcing is for the broad reason that, in general, plant-based foods have a lower environmental impact than animal-based foods. And that applies for cooking fats, but all kinds of other foods.
I feel like my grocery store is always trying to get me to buy fancier types of oil, like grapeseed oil and safflower oil instead of canola oil. Is there any reason why good old canola oil isn't a good option?
It's a great question. Canola oil is actually one of the healthiest oils. It's close to olive oil in nutritional profile. There's, I know, canola oil kind of like gets a bad rap. I don't know why exactly. It's not terribly flavorful, which is actually really useful in a lot of types of cooking because of its neutral flavor profile. There's the issue of smoke point, which does come up into the question in the chat. I actually have a list in the book that goes by, I don't have these memorized, that goes item by item in terms of smoke point. So there's some concern that if you're using an oil that doesn't do well at really high temperatures, you are going to be inhaling like yucky, smoke basically. But the coconut oil thing is weird to me. Essentially, like all the vegan and the vegan products I see are almost all like first ingredient coconut oil, and they're positioning themselves as health foods. When if you actually look at quick labels, also tidbits. The two most important things to look for on a package when it comes to your health are the ingredients list and the nutrition facts panel. All of the front of a package is marketing. That's space that a company can do anything they want with. The parts that are required, that are standardized, are the really boring black and white parts on the side or the back that are the ingredients and the nutrition facts. The first ingredients are listed in descending order by weight. So the first ingredient is by far the most important. In other countries, they actually list by percentage, which would be really helpful because you could get a sense of the relativity, like is this 90% whatever the first ingredient is and 1% the next, or some kind of gradation would be great. We don't have that, but it does go in descending order. And then on the nutrition facts, it does list, like, the things to look for are basically sodium and saturated fat and added sugar. You want to keep those at bay. And then fiber, we have a nationwide fiber crisis. Basically, almost nobody eats enough fiber. And unsaturated fats, you want to actually get a good amount of. So those are things to look for, as well as calories. So on the coconut oil thing, it baffles me that these products are positioned as health foods when there's really not a lot to say in favor of coconut oil, other than the flavor, which can be great and works with all kinds of, recipes and cuisines that really, where you want like a coconut flavor. Those would be times that I would say great to cook with that, or great to have a product that is kind of in that type of flavor profile.
I jump
Super
in
interesting.
Can I jump in off of coconut oil and just ask you that, like, superfoods, are they super? We know they're foods. Are they even foods? I don't know. Can you share a little bit more about that, since that I feel like that's all marketing, but the internet loves that.
Yeah. So I tend to be very wary of magic bullet framings. So with food is complicated. And so we look for ways to make food simple. So it's if we could have a list of everything to avoid, everything to just load up on. We have a very, I describe this in my first book as well, there's because of that lack of food literacy and lack of it's really confidence in our own knowledge and intuition about what to eat. People know fruits and vegetables are healthy. Why is it then that produce consumption has been completely flat forever, and 1 in 10 Americans eat the recommended servings, knowing and doing about the same things, because there's so much disinformation coming at you, right? It's saying, unless you eat organic, then you're actually doing more harm than good. That's not true. Actually, what matters is just whatever form you can access and afford fruits and vegetables are better than not eating fruits and vegetables. So the superfoods framing is very appealing, and it draws mostly on the science of antioxidants. So there's definitely something to that, right? Polyphenols, the plant compounds that are shown to be protective in blueberries and things that are bright, like spinach, kale, etc. There's definitely something to that in terms of the nutrition science, but it doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't mean that, it's not all or nothing. Again, it's not okay, your diet should only consist of superfoods, because the other thing about superfoods, a lot of them have almost no calories. So how are you going to feel full by the end of the day if you only eat superfoods? It's also extremely expensive to eat only superfoods. So anyways, there's some signal to you that there's nutritional value in those foods, but it doesn't mean we as Americans have a bandwagon kind of, again, all or nothing mindset that's very forced upon us through a lot of pop culture. And I think it's more to just think of great, keep it in the mix. It probably checks at least the box of good for me. Now I can look into these other questions. Is it good for others? How is it grown? What are the environmental impacts? What are the social impacts? Are there any animals involved, right? So it's a starting point. It's not the end point.
I'm wondering if, Kurt, you want to jump in with any questions on oils in particular, or anything that's on your mind?
I was a bit surprised to hear that around coconut oil. So I think some others are probably, because they are always kind of equate the positioning of it and price with, and from what I've read is that, not being necessarily bad for you, but it's always good to, hear new information. So no, I don't. I've put all my questions in the chat. I think it's it's been really informative.
Yeah, I'll put in the chat, there's some links to 2 different New York Times pieces that I think will just, from a nutrition, it sounds like folks are mostly interested in this question from a nutrition perspective. So anyway, I do the whole coconut oil deep dive. And then of course in the book, but not quite as much detail. So yeah, what else is on your mind?
Yeah, that's super, super helpful because I always feel like canola oil is the last thing I should be buying because I can buy it in bulk and it's cheap, so I assume it's bad. But then one day I was just looking at it and I was realizing like it's a plant-based oil and there's probably no reason why I shouldn't be using this. And to your point about marketing and sort of like the front of the label, I think that takes up a lot of real estate in the consumer's mind. And on the shelves. So it's easy to be led by the fancy packaging of smaller or more exotic oils.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to kind of, I think the root of a lot of the, so again, there's so much misinformation and disinformation about what to eat, which is a huge part of why I wanted to give like the tiebreaker answer in this book. It's like, I have an independent fact checker. It's rigorously evidence-based. It is not, this or that, like kind of an influencer who's probably, paid by whatever company to endorse or discourage you from eating a certain item. But the root of, I think, the mythology around coconut or canola not being healthy is GMOs. So I did not write about GMOs in the book because I think the science is not fully settled, and there are a lot of other reasons I didn't really go into detail. But that's where people got concerned about it, was that it's genetically engineered. Some of it, or almost all of it, is genetically engineered. Now, if you're worried about that, you can get organic canola oil, which would mean it's not genetically engineered. And on the environmental side, there's not a ton of information available about canola production, but in short, it's got one of the lowest carbon footprints. It's up there with sunflower oil as the lowest carbon footprint for a plant oil.
That's super interesting. I have a couple more burning questions. Others, feel free to write them in the chat too if you have other ones we want to get to in the next few minutes. 2 other questions we got before. One was about nuts, especially almonds, and basically which are the best nuts to eat for us and for the planet. And the second question was about local and seasonal, and if those 2 words matter.
Yes. Okay, I'll answer the second one quickly because the nuts one is a little bit shorter, or a little bit longer. Okay, so my main take on local is that it's more important to think about regional as opposed to a strict radius around your home or the place where you're buying something. There are a lot of restaurants that have gone that direction, and that can be great from a relationship perspective, right? Like knowing people in your community, in your neighborhood, supporting local economies. But many people are surprised to know that the miles traveled, food miles, is actually a very small percentage of the total carbon footprint of producing a food. What matters a lot more is how the food was produced or raised. So does local matter? Yes, for the reasons I just mentioned of local economies, relationships, provenance, maybe there's diverse varietals in your area that aren't available elsewhere. It's incredibly important to eat a greater diversity of foods. Right now, 75% of the foods we eat come from just 12 types of plants and 5 species of animals. What a missed opportunity. So eating seasonally is also a great way to eat a greater diversity of foods and to enjoy peak flavor. So why is eating seasonally important? Well, if we know that in general, eating plant-based foods is better for you and for the planet, when you eat foods that taste better, you get a positive feedback loop. You're like, wow, tried this Romanesco cauliflower. It tasted amazing. I'm likely to eat that again. If you have negative, you or your kids or your parents or whoever have negative experiences with plant-based foods, you're less likely to repeat that behavior, which means that in the long run, your life's total carbon footprint, water footprint, your own health is likely going to be worse. So that's the biggest reason I would say that eating seasonally is important. Is you're gonna like it better. It's gonna taste better. It's gonna be peak flavor, and you might get some varieties and different types than you're used to, which might just delight you and be fun and something different. Nuts. So the basic thing to know about the water footprint of almonds is that it's actually not that high in relative terms. It's gotten, pegged as like the poster nut of high water footprints. But I can explain a little bit about what's behind that. So most of the nuts produced, most of almond production comes from California, and California has had years of terrible drought. And there's been a lot of gripes about the fact that 2/3 of almonds grown in California are exported. And so this is called virtual water because it gets shipped abroad. There's also the concerns about wildlife, kind of their habitats being threatened when water levels get dangerously low. And so there was an endangered king salmon in Northern California where this happened from water being diverted to almond farms. So, people learn, oh my gosh, it takes a gallon of water to produce just one almond. I better stop eating almonds. Suddenly something seen as a sign of a health conscious eater is making you almond shamed in the grocery store. So this is all true, but there's some really important caveats. One is that the high footprint for almonds is in part because almond growers have amazingly cushy water rights in California, and they haven't been incentivized to use water efficiently. Flood irrigation has long been the norm. And so that actually has started to change quite a bit post-expose, but that's actually a small fraction of the reason that of this caveat, which is that it's all relative. So it takes 37 gallons, 1 gallon of water per almond. So, okay, that's kind of a lot. Like a serving would be, 13 gallons or 20 gallons, depending on how many almonds fit in your hand. But it takes 37 gallons to produce your cup of coffee. Nobody's talking about that. Or the 450 gallons it takes to make your chocolate bar. Or the 660 gallons to make a burger. So the comparison with animal-based foods in general for water footprint is super unfavorable, and that big picture message totally gets lost. So I said this before, but with every food choice, you have to ask yourself, as opposed to what? And almonds are low carbon footprint. They're incredibly healthy. So we have to look at this holistically, right? And think about, what are you eating almonds instead of? Are you eating instead of cheese, right? Are you eating instead of something less healthy? The bare kind of comparison in terms of the nut spectrum is that there are many nuts. That's the other thing, is you don't need to only eat almonds to eat healthy. There are tons of great nuts that are all super healthy. And walnuts and pistachios are pretty similar. If you wanted to be probably winning the Joro contests, peanuts are the lowest water users, and in general, the lowest environmental footprint. They're super affordable also. And that's because peanuts are actually legumes, which have all kinds of, nitrogen fixing properties and other good things for the plant.
Super interesting. So if you wanted to get extra credit, and you're equally happy having peanut butter and almond butter, you might as well pick peanut butter.
Yeah.
But you should also keep in mind that we actually did this comparison. A slice of toast with peanut butter has the same protein as half a chicken breast. So if you're trying to get your protein fix, a slice of toast with peanut butter or almond butter is probably relatively much better than that piece of chicken you could be having instead. Those
are exactly the kind of trade-offs to be asking yourself. Exactly. And to not be eschewing things that, again, it's all a spectrum. And so asking yourself, what you're replacing is super important. It's folks have to jump off. We're out of time. I know we're out of time. I think maybe this has been incredible to start with. I just wanted to say thank you so much for answering our stupid questions and the things that I feel like I don't know who else to ask. So I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
This is amazing. I feel like if everyone hasn't already, go read Sophie's book and go read all of her columns in the New York Times. I want to ask if you have one final reflection on kind of what Rachel's question was here, but things that people should sort of, the like top 1 or 2 things that you tell people, just don't worry about that at all, because it doesn't matter. I feel like GMOs maybe is one of them. But anything else that you would say is just a total red herring and ignore it?
Yeah, red herring is an interesting question. I mean, I would put almonds in that category. I think you had all these people who got really comfortable, like, this is my mid-morning snack. And then they're just like, crap, I'll go back, I'll eat beef jerky because almonds have a high water content. I'm like, no. Worse for health, worse for the planet, not the right direction. So I think almonds would be in that category. Grains. There's a lot of carb phobia, and in general, whole grains are phenomenal. We didn't get to talk about that, but for all kinds of, there's actually a good amount of protein in some grains, fiber, amazing set of nutritional benefits, low environmental imprints. There's a huge diversity of grains, whole grains to be discovered and enjoyed, intact, and ones you can cook, those that can be milled into flours. So I would just say don't be afraid of grains. If there's like the big, gluten-free, of course, is important for those where that's a medical necessity. But for the vast majority of people, you can enjoy particularly whole grains. Refined grains aren't so hot for human health with an easy conscious. And there's a lot of delicious diversity to be enjoyed there. So I think those would be the main ones.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the really, I feel like, very practical and grounded view to food. So thank you.
I appreciate it. Well, we're kindred spirits in that sense. Joro is very much the same, and excited for the challenge. Great to meet all of you, Ish, and good luck with the lifelong pursuit of conscious eating.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
Sophie.
care. Thank you all.
Take care. Good night.
Bye.